Hi, I'm Josh Bowmar with Bowmar Bowhunting, and today I'm going to break down how to build the perfect arrow. Now, I know that sounds kind of crazy, and you're like, well, I can just go to the store and buy one, but I promise you, if you build your own arrows and fletch your own arrows and glue in your own inserts, there's a lot of things you can do to make that arrow better and more accurate, and we're going to dive into every single one of those steps today. Let's get started. So figuring out what arrow you want is actually a little more complicated than you think. Are you hunting turkeys? Are you gonna hunt deer, elk? Are you going on a Cape buffalo hunt? There's a lot of different options out there in terms of styles of arrows, like super light and fast arrows, maybe a more like robust and beefy arrow. There's a lot of choices, and we're gonna dive into those right now, and I'm gonna show you guys some examples. So, for example, if you're going on a Cape buffalo hunt, you may want to shoot something like this Easton Dangerous Game. This was actually the arrow I killed my Cape buffalo with. And you can see this point, this is a 250 grain point. It's also got a 75 grain brass insert in here, and this arrow weighs 900 grains. You're not going to want to use this for deer hunting in the Midwest, but this could be an arrow you're going to want to build for, you know, a Cape buffalo setup. Or if you're going turkey hunting, and let's say you're turkey hunting and you're using a giant decapitating broadhead like this, you're going to want the stiffest arrow on the market for this, especially if you're shooting like 70 pounds. So a great choice of that would be like a Black Eagle Spartan arrow that's 200 spine. This arrow is even stiffer than the Cape buffalo arrow. So this would be a great example of something you could use with a decapitating broadhead, because the stiffer, the better. You don't want the arrow to be flexing at all when you're shooting one of these. Now, if you're shooting, so turkeys, and also light, you want as light as you can when you're shooting this because you want it to be fast. Anyway, turkeys, now let's say you're just shooting a normal setup for deer and you're wanting a ultra lightweight arrow that's not a micro sized arrow, then like an Easton Hex would be a great. This is super lightweight, but it's 6mm. You know, me personally, I've recently made the switch to shooting the micro diameter and ultra stiff and light X Impacts from Black Eagle. This arrow is a beast. I really like this a lot. Ultra lightweight, ultra tiny, you can see in comparison. Like the size, this is a 200 spine and this is a 400, so it's going to be definitely smaller. I like this. Let me grab another arrow real quick and show you guys. So this will give you a more accurate representation of the size difference. So this is a 400 and then this is a 400. So you can kind of see how much smaller this is. So the smaller arrows I found have better wind drift. You know, they drift less, I should say, in the wind. And I like the smaller because think about it like a heel. If someone steps on your toe, it hurts, right? But if they're wearing a high heel, it hurts a lot more. So for me, building a perfect arrow is definitely a micro diameter, lightweight arrow that's got decent FOC. And so for my build, I shoot 82 pounds. I'm shooting high poundage, so I'm going to be using a 200 spine arrow because I want to build up the front with a little bit of front weight and get decent FOC. So when you're choosing your arrow, my ultimate advice is going to be obviously somewhere in the middle between fast and heavy. I don't like shooting an ultra heavy arrow because animals duck, and the more that they're moving, the worse it's going to be, obviously, on impact. I also don't like a super light arrow. If I have the choice, I would rather shoot a heavy arrow, simply because the lighter the arrow, the more effect wind has on it and elements. And since I'm a hunter, then that's an issue, because most of the time, especially in spot and stalk situations, I'm going to be shooting things in not so great conditions. Like, you get closer to animals when it's windy. You just do. And so when it's super quiet and conditions are perfect, you know, then maybe a light arrow works better. But in my opinion, I think there's a middle ground for that. And we'll dive in later in the video on exactly what grain per pound of bow weight you should shoot. But for the intro of this, picking an arrow, I think a micro diameter, lightweight arrow is the best, and then you build it from there. So let's dive in to the next part. So the first step with building the ultimate arrow is you need to check the arrows that you buy to make sure they're all exactly within tolerances of each other. Now, what I mean by that is spine tolerances, because nothing will make an arrow more inaccurate than a mislabeled arrow or an arrow that spine is way outside the normal. And so what I use is this Ram arrow spine tester, and this is expensive, honestly, guys. So this may be something you ask your pro shop to do for you after you buy a dozen arrows. Some of those guys will have this, and if they don't, then I'll show you a test in a minute you can do on your leg to kind of test it. But you want to test the spine and just make sure that all the arrows are similar. Now, keep in mind, the higher quality arrow you buy, the least important a lot of these steps are. But if you're buying cheap arrows, what I'm going to teach you and show you guys right now is so critical, because the cheaper the arrow, the less tolerances it has for perfection. So what I'm going to teach you is how to get out all the imperfections for your arrows. So the higher end, so say you're buying like an X Impact from a Black Eagle, or maybe like a Pro Comp from Easton, or like the Gold Tip, I think they're Pierce line series. They have high-end lined arrows, and those arrows are vetted, I should say, on getting out the bad ones. So, but if you're buying cheap arrows, they don't do that with the bad ones. So let's dive through here. So this Ram, I'm not going to show you guys how to use this, but what I'll do is I'll just crank this sucker to 0 for the first one right here, and then I'll take this weight. I'll take this weight and hook it here. All right, so that goes to 40. All right, and so as long as it's within, you know, within a tight of 10, like I don't even know what the new number is for there, but it's, as long as it's within 10 of each other. There, almost exactly the same, 40. You can see that. So, and then I just go through and I keep checking these. And then, so the reason you want to do this is because if there's one 40, again, and it doesn't take a long time, but I just want to check all these, because if there is an arrow that is bad, then I need to throw that arrow out. Or it's a junk squirrel arrow or something along those lines. But checking the spine of these arrows is definitely the most important step, because if it's off, sometimes you'll get a mislabeled one and I might have like a 400 or something in here. But that usually doesn't happen with the reputable companies, you know, so like if you're working on the high-end line with like Easton or Black Eagle or something, you're not going to really have those issues. All right, last one. Checking. And bam, all perfect. They're all almost exact, so that's good. So now after I check the spine of the arrow, I know that the spine is good to go. So now what I want to do is I want to get out the bad ones. So the Pine Ridge spinner is a fine one. I actually made this one out of arrows I busted up, and then I used a weight kind of in the middle to help with this. So I made it a little bit longer. So now what I want to do is I'm going to spin these arrows and check to see which ones are bad. Now, arrow companies are going to hate me for telling you this, but if that arrow company, if this arrow is the exact same on each end, the way to get the best out of each arrow is to cut from the end that is not straight. So if you spin this and the back is really wobbly and the front is really good, then you're going to want to cut everything from the back, or vice versa. And so if the front's really bad, usually you chop off the front, because you want to get that sucker as straight as possible. So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll just take and wipe off the label, and then that way I don't see which end's which, because it won't matter for this specific arrow. Some arrows are built in a way that they have front of center added into the shaft. You don't want to do that because you'll make a bad arrow. But if it's like this, just a regular old tubed arrow, same on both ends, it's not necessarily a bad idea to wipe off the logo and just cut from whichever end is the most wobbly. Or if you don't care in your quiver that it's not the same, then it won't matter. You can leave it on there. All right, so what I want to do is I'm going to go through and mark which end is least straight. Again, really high-end arrows, like an Easton Pro Comp or competition grade arrow, or like these Black Eagles, for example. The straightness tolerance is 0.001. Some companies do better jobs at keeping that tolerance actual, 0.001 than others. And I know Black Eagle does a great job with this because that's been my experience anytime I've ever got a dozen from these guys. So this one here, I'm going to look, and then I'm going to mark the bad end. So if you're shooting cheap arrows, this is also very critical because your arrows will not spin like what I'm going to show you here. They're going to be like wobbly and terrible. So if you're buying cheap arrows, you're going to want to pay attention to this. And let's get started. So this arrow, we'll go ahead and spin it. So you can see how it's pretty good, but it's not exactly perfect, right? And so then I flip it over. And so like this one, you can see the back end is a little worse than the front end. Okay, so I'll mark this one, and I'm going to cut that sucker from the back. Okay, there we got that one. So there you can see the front is worse than the back, and sometimes you can't even tell. So I'll mark the front on this one. That one's really good. A little worse on the back. So I'll mark the back of the arrow. All right, and flip it over. That one's kind of hard to tell. I would probably say the back. And if you had to choose, the back of the arrow is more important to keep straight. Alrighty. There's that. Oh, definitely the front on this one. And so you go through here and you're just going to be marking the bad arrows. See, that one's real obvious. So look at this one. Look at the back of this one. And then look at the front. So the reason you want to mark is because now when I chop this arrow, I'm going to chop off some of that wobble. And what that'll do is help me get a straighter arrow. Otherwise, if I only chop everything from the front, now I'm going to be running into issues with consistencies amongst the shafts. You always want your shafts to be as straight as possible. All right, so I've marked the bad ones, and then that is the next step, is you check the spine of the arrow, and then you want to spin them, and then you want to mark the end that is less perfect. And so the thicker the spine of these arrows, a lot of times, like you'll notice some wobble in these. And I'll be right back. I'll show you Sarah's 400s. I wanted to show you guys these because typically when you shoot like high poundage, I'm going to use these 200s, but a lot of you guys are going to be shooting these 400s. So I wanted to show you guys the difference with 400s or lighter spine. There's just less material, so they're a little easier to get straight. Watch this. You ready? So this is a typical standard that you would see. Extremely straight arrows, like from X Impacts, which is what I really like. So yeah, I just wanted to show you guys, you know, how straight. And that, again, the cheaper the arrow you get, the crappier that spin will be and the less accurate that arrow could be. But that doesn't mean that the arrow won't work for you guys. So I'm not telling you to go out there and spend $200 on a dozen, but I'm telling you, if you do shoot like a cheaper arrow, if you go through these, you can chop from both ends, you can chop from one end, you're gonna get the best out of the dozen that you buy. And that's the whole point of this video, is I'm gonna break down and teach you guys how to get the best out of your dozen and all the steps to go into it. So we've covered, you know, selecting your arrow depending on what kind of deer, turkey, elk, whatever you're hunting. Once you figure out your spine and the type of arrow you're going to want to build, whether you want to build a lightning fast one or a high FOC one, that'll depend on the spine of the arrow that you get. If you're still curious about this, ask the pro shopper, ask the company that you're buying from, and they'll also help you out on exactly what to get. And then, you know, we covered step number one is check the spine of the arrow. Again, the cheaper the arrow, the more variability you'll have between the spines of a dozen. So the higher end you get, the more tighter the tolerances are for the spine. And then lastly, you're going to want to spin, or I shouldn't say lastly, we got a lot more to cover, guys. But the next step, you're going to want to spin these arrows and mark the bad end so you know which end to cut off of. And again, this part is very critical to make sure you get the back of your arrow as straight as possible. So if you're stuck in between where you don't know where to cut the front or the back, choose to make sure the back is straight. So if the back is perfectly straight like this, for example, you know, you spin it and that's perfectly straight, no reason to cut off the back, I'm gonna cut off the front. And so we're gonna move on now to the next step. So next up, we are going to go over how to figure out the length of your arrow. And I know a lot of guys think this is simple. Oh, I'll just put it in, draw back, and mark it. And that is not the case. There's a lot to take in consideration when figuring out the length of your arrow. For example, you know, a lot of guys will just chop it off to where that arrow sticks out in front of their riser. Well, I mean, that's fine if that's what you want to do. But the reality is, like this arrow, for example, 200 spine weighs 11 grains per inch. So that means there's 11 grains per inch of arrow. So if there's 11 grains, there's 11, 22, 33. We're talking about 33 extra grains of arrow weight that we necessarily don't need. So I like to run my arrow as short as possible, which is typically right about a ½ inch in front of my rest. That way there's some variability in the pulling through the shot. But I run about a ½ inch to a ¼ inch in front of the rest. And you're like, okay, great, well, let's draw back and chop it off right there. That's not a good idea either. You're gonna need to figure out a lot of things. You know, for example, if you're the type of person that shoots lighted nocks, well, if you look at a lighted nock, it's got a longer throat than what comes standard, for example. I think this is like an Easton Deep 6 nock or something. So we're talking about there's like almost a ¼ inch there. So if you're a type of person that bounces back and forth between, oh, I only want to hunt with lighted nocks, I don't want to waste the money and practice with them, well, you're also going to run into tuning issues because this weighs almost double that than this. But what you need to consider is if you go and put this sucker in here, you know, or this is now a ¼ inch longer, and you go and then chop that sucker off right here. Well, now whenever you put on the smaller nock, this now comes back a ¼ inch and your arrow is too short. So that's also an issue. You know, so you want to figure out what kind of nock you want to leave. So if you are planning on bouncing back and forth to save money, then you're going to want to always pick the smaller of the nocks, because then that's going to give you the most accurate distance from here. So if you pick the larger nock, it'll give you more up here, but then you're likely to get too short. So again, if you're bouncing back and forth, always choose the smaller nock. All right, another thing to take in consideration is your insert choices. Like for example, if you come back here and you just draw back and then you chop that arrow off right there, well, if you're going to use like a Black Eagle insert, this insert goes over the shaft almost a full inch. Well, it probably is a full inch. So right here, that's how much of the arrow is actually inside of that. So if you were to come over here and chop it off right there, well, then when you glue your inserts on, now your insert's over your rest. And you don't want that either. So you got to be able to measure this, and this is actually pretty easy. All I do is I will grab two things. I'll show you guys how I do this. It's pretty simple. I'll just, if I'm going to shoot like this type of insert, I'll take this insert and I'll stick it on the arrow, and then I'll mark it with this pin. Just like that. And then I'll pop that insert off, get a tape measure out, measure that, so it's just shy of an inch. Well, yep, just shy of an inch, so I would add an extra inch if I was going to use one of these arrows. So for example, if I want the back of that arrow to be within 1/4 of an inch, then I would need to add an extra inch to the arrow. Or if you use one of these style of inserts, this is the Easton Titanium half out. This guy, when you put it in, it runs flush with the tip of the arrow. So this guy you could cut almost a full inch shorter, just because it obviously runs to the very end. So just options out there. That's not right or wrong. This is set at 55 grains. So then if you're getting set at 55 grains, you have no adjustability with that, which is why I like the focus system in X Impacts, because they got inserts that go inside and outside, but then you can adjust the weight for tuning reasons. I like having that than just a set stone insert. And also with these inserts, pop this sucker out, they're made of titanium, so they don't break. But the problem is they're only as tough as what surrounds them. So if I were to use like this insert and I hit a hard wall, it'll blow out the wall of your arrow. And so if you have like an inside and outside system, you know, then you got aluminum on the inside and then you got aluminum on the outside. Now that's a much tougher and better system. And I'll show a quick example of that. Just like with this. So I would use something like this. So I have the insert, it would go down inside, and then you would have an insert that goes over. So now it's protected on both sides of the carbon. That arrow won't break at the tip. So if I bend this, I can just pop this off and replace it. So I do like that focus system that Black Eagle has. I think Ethics Archery also has an insert-outsert system, which is really cool. But you want to take these things into consideration whenever you're cutting your arrow. Another thing you want to take in consideration is broadhead choice. So let's say you get it all figured out, right, and you decide you're just going to run a normal insert. So let's just say it looks like, let me grab one of these arrows over here. Okay. All right, so let's say you're shooting like a hex arrow that doesn't have an insert-outsert system, and get that right there. Let's say you're shooting a hex arrow that's got an insert that looks like this, which is probably most common. Well, you go and you cut it to right here, a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch, and you decide you're going to use like a Rage tri-pan. Well, now you're screwed, because now those blades come back, as you can see right there, those blades come back over the arrow. So if you were to cut this too short, then your blades are going to hit your rest, and that'll cause the blades to deploy, cause tuning issues, and obviously you can't have that. But if you shoot like a sever, like this, and you thread that sucker in there, the blades don't go back behind the arrow shaft itself. So you can cut that exact to length, you know, down to, you know, again, I like to leave about a 1/2 inch to a 1/4 inch. So you got to, I'm going through all these not so obvious examples. I mean, it seems obvious saying it now, but I couldn't tell you how many times I was in Montana once elk hunting, and I didn't realize, because we went from one place to another, I switched from a lighted knock that I did this to a normal knock, because we weren't legally allowed to use lighted knocks, and we weren't I can't, yeah, we were allowed to use mechanicals. And then I switched to a mechanical. So I chopped off and cut it within that 1/2 inch. I used a smaller nock, and it was a Rage hypodermic, which is this guy. I went full draw testing my setup, and my arrow kept deploying, like the broadhead kept deploying. I was like, what the heck? It kept deploying, and come to find out I cut my arrow too short. So in the field, I had to make my draw length shorter because of that. So I'm telling you all this because of real life situations that you need to pay attention to and take in consideration. So again, figure out the broadhead you're going to choose. If you're going to shoot a broadhead like a no collar Rage, hypodermic, or anything, you're going to want to leave an extra 1/2 inch. Take that in consideration. Unless, of course, you're using like one of these inserts. Because, whoops, let me throw this arrow down. Because if you're using these inserts, they stick out further than the arrow. So then, obviously there, you don't have to worry about it. So your arrow rest will come back to here, like this. Will come back to here, and then your broadhead's way out here. So it'd look more like that. So it, again, just depends on your broadhead setup or in your insert choice. So once you figure out what you're going to do, that's why the first step is to figure out what kind of arrow you want, because there's a lot of factors that go into play here. So once you figure all this out and you get it cut to about a 1/2 inch, you also need to take in consideration the style of sight that you're doing and the level of tuning you're going to do. I am crazy when it comes to all this stuff, especially tuning. So what I like to do is torque tune. And again, that's a total different video. There's actually a lot of videos on YouTube to learn how to do this. But basically what torque tuning is at full draw, let me just go full draw so you guys can see here. Grab an arrow. So this would be pretty crazy actually. This is a real thing. So I can draw this bow back like this, and then I can grab my riser and twist it. So you can see the twist. So I could literally twist it like this. So this is neutral, twist it, recenter my peep in sight, and still hit the bullseye. That's actually a real thing. And you could do it both ways. And so how you do that, it's the relationship between your sight and your rest. There's a magic window where these two work perfectly together that it won't miss. So that's why I shoot a dovetail that's adjustable here, and it can adjust back and forth. Like if I peel this back, you see all these different spots. You see all these different spots. There's holes that allow you to be able to adjust this sight back and forth. So if you shoot and it's to the left or to the right, you can adjust this back and forth to be able to torque tune. Now, the reason I bring all this up, you're like, why did he just jump into torque tuning? We were talking about arrow length. This is why. Because now, if you don't shoot a dovetail, or you don't shoot a peep sight that has an adjustable aperture. That's why I really like the Hamskea rest or the Hamskea peep sights, and I just switched and started shooting the Podium peep sight. That's because they have adjustable apertures. I can pop that out and put in different apertures based on where this dovetail sits and finishes up on my tune or for the torque tune. So let's say you have a normal peep that doesn't have adjustability and you have a fixed pin sight that's not a dovetail. This is now important for you because if you are going to cut your arrow length and you do plan on torque tuning with a fixed pin, you have to move your rest forwards and backwards. So that's important to know because if you don't shoot a dovetail and you don't have an aperture or adjustable sight, then you're going to need to torque tune your bow with your rest where you move it back and forth. So you got to leave wiggle room for that. So if you, for example, I would leave an extra, whatever it is, you know, whatever the distance is that it can go back and forward. I would leave an extra 1.5 to 2 inches till you can torque tune and figure out exactly, you know, where that rest will sit. So I know that was pretty crazy and in depth, and a lot of that seems like common sense, but I can promise you it is not common sense, or I'm just a big dummy, because I've made this mistake so many times. And especially if you're a DIY guy that does all of your own stuff like I do, you're gonna make these mistakes. And arrows aren't cheap, and they take a long time to build when you build them right, and like we're going through. So when you're doing all of this, start and finish with one arrow. I couldn't tell you how many times I get the arrow cut and then I'll cut the whole dozen, and then I realize I wanted to switch to a different insert because maybe the heavy insert wasn't working well and the spine was too weak. So then I switched to a different insert, and now that insert I switched to goes back an extra ½ inch, and now none of those arrows in that doesn't work. I just blew like 170 bucks. So that is not good. So again, start to finish, build one arrow at a time. Make sure that sucker shoots perfect and like a dream, and everything is exactly the way you want it before you dive in to the next part before you dive in and cutting all your arrows. So now that we've figured out exactly how to cut your arrows and what length, let's dive into the next part. All right, so once you figured out the exact length that you're going to want to cut, I recommend adding on about 1/8 of an inch extra, because you will square your arrows up with a squaring tool, which you grind off the end. So you're going to grind off just a smidge, but leave about an extra 1/8 of an inch. And so pretty standard, cut the arrow, just make sure it's on your marked end. So like this one, it looks like I cut from the front. So I'm going to cut this end off. Okay, so now that end was wobbly, so we come back over here and look at that. So I don't know if you guys can remember, but this was that really wobbly arrow. And remember when we tested the both ends, that this side of it was the wobbly, so I chopped it off. Now look at it. That is why you want to do this. So now this arrow that was potentially crap because it had a wobbly end, and that's exaggerating, but I mean, it could have been worse than what it was, but I chopped off the wobble end and now it's straight. So the next thing you're going to want to do is square the ends. Now I am very generous when it comes to this, so I take off quite a bit. And this is, I believe, a squaring tool from Fire Knock. Okay, so I grind and grind and grind because I want this to be perfectly square. So, and then I always tap them out too, because you can see when I tapped, all that fell out. And the reason I do that is because whenever I glue this, I don't want all that extra dust in there. So again, I do both ends. I square up both ends. This is important. And I feel it whenever it kind of gets square. You can feel it. And I'm like, okay, that's it. And it's like perfect. And again, watch this right here. Watch how much dust comes out. So make sure you tap it. Right there. All right, there's one more step you're going to want to do after squaring your nocks if you shoot a 4mm style of arrow. That's whether you shoot an Easton, gold tip, any of the 4mm. You're going to want to do this next step too, especially if you shoot a lighted nock, or really any nock for that matter. And that is taper the back of your arrow. And the reason is a lot of people will look at a nock like this, for example, and they think that that is perfectly 90 degrees. But the truth is it's not. So in the injection molding like this, it's really hard to get exactly 90 degrees. So when you actually slide this arrow in, or this nock as is, if you look really, really close, it's actually not flush. And it's hard to see. It really is, but it's not flush. So what you want to do is you want to use a tapering sort of grinder. This comes with like every single deep 6 arrow system from Easton. So I know, like at your pro shop, they probably have 1,000 of these laying around. So if you just go to your local pro shop and ask for like a deep 6 tapering tool, they'll be able to give this to you. But anyway, what I'll do is I'll take the arrow and I'll stick it right on top of this sucker. And then I'm just going to taper this end out. So it doesn't take much, but it does take some. And what that does is that creates a nice little tapered spot for this nock to fit in there super flush. So I don't know if you can tell the difference or not, but anyway, now it is super flush. And this matters. So again, now we take this and look how straight that arrow is. So if you're having some nocking issues or nock spinning and you think that it's close to being straight, make sure that's squared, and then make sure you taper the end that the nock's going in. And that will conclude that step. So the next step, you want to index all of your arrows. This is actually extremely important, especially if you shoot cheap arrows, because the cheaper the arrow, the more prevalent it's going to be whenever you actually do this. And I know this is using this machine again. I'm actually going to show you at the end of this segment on how to do this on your leg, so you don't need this machine. But this is a great way to do it, and it's very, very precise. So what I mean by indexing is I'm going to find the stiff side of the arrow. So when you look at this tube, there is a spot in this tube that will be the stiffest, and a spot that'll be the weakest. I want to find that stiff spot and mark it, because then what I'll do is I'll fletch all my arrows with the stiff side up. That way every single arrow is fletched the exact same on every single arrow. So that is going to be important for extreme accuracies. Again, this is for the extreme. As you guys are saying, you know, I take this arrow building to a whole new level, and we're just getting started with the advanced side of things. So this kind of building up to this part was kind of basic, but now it's getting advanced, and this is step number 1 in my advanced arrow building. So let's go and find out what I'm talking about with this index. Okay, so this right here, this scale, I'll crank, once I put the arrow on, I'm going to put this in here, and I'm going to put it on to 0. Actually, before I do that, I need to put some arrow snot on this. So basically this is just like an arrow lubricant for targets, but I actually like to use this because it'll help whenever I spin this. It'll help whenever I spin this to help. First thing I want to do is I want to check I guess the straightness throughout the whole spine. So you place your fingers over the rollers, and then I'm just going to roll this, and I'm looking for this to move. As you'll see, like when this moves, it bounces back and forth. So I'm going to roll this now, and I'm looking for variability. So you can see there's a tiny little bit. That's probably the stiffness of the arrow, or the stiff side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add this weight, which comes with this ram tester. We're going to load that puppy on there, and I'm going to bounce this a couple times to get it perfect. Okay, now what I'm looking for is a spike or a drop in this system. So as I roll this like this, I'm going to go slow, and I'm looking for the highest spike. So you can see, there we go. It's cranked up pretty high, so I'm going to look at the arrow and remember that, and I'm going to see if I can get it higher. Oh, there we go. And there you can start to see it's dropping now, so I know I need to go back and find that exact stiffest spot. And that it's right there. Okay, once I find the stiff side of the arrow, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a marker on the side that I'm going to fletch. And then what I'm going to do is mark right down the center between the rollers. So now I know that that is the stiff side of my arrow. And it's so important because now whenever I go and I fletch this arrow, which we'll get to, and I'll break down everything that I do with fletching too. Just hang in there with me, guys. I know this is a lot of information and it can be overwhelming, but I promise you, if you follow all these steps, this will make you a better shot and give you the most accurate dozen arrows humanly possible. So indexing your arrows is important. Now, when this isn't important is if you use an aluminum arrow. Aluminum arrows typically don't have, you know, harsh indexes. And so that's why you see a lot of people shoot aluminum carbon composites, where if the aluminum's on the inside, it's an accurate arrow, like I think Easton Pro Comps or I think they're Easton Pro Comps, I think is one of them. They're X10s, similar arrow. That arrow is great because it doesn't have an index. So, but if you're shooting carbon, like most of us that want to shoot a lightweight arrow, you're going to want to index these and then fletch them all the exact same. So I marked it, strong side. I feel like it's easier to do that. Strong side marked. So I'll go through every one of my arrows. Now this is important because with as you saw there wasn't a huge spike. Well, a high quality arrow will have little spikes because that index where the carbon comes together, the more expensive arrows, that isn't as noticeable. Where if you get a cheaper arrow or a really weak spined arrow, that becomes more and more noticeable. So I'm going to show you an example. This is a good arrow, actually. We shot this arrow for a long time, but it's a weak spined. This is a hex arrow. So I know this specific arrow has some variability in this. So if I go to 0, and then I need to move this, even it up a little there. All right, and we'll pull this to 0. So I'm going to roll this on the rollers. So you can see how dramatic it is with this specific arrow. So there's 0. And then, so you can see how dramatic that is in that arrow. And so the point is, not all arrows are the same. Like if I go through all of these X impacts, for example, some are going to be better than others. You know, so this was just an example of one that has a large variability. Nothing against a hex arrow. I killed my biggest deer ever with this arrow. But I just knew there's an arrow I had in the batch that was bad. And so again, this is a high-end 0.001 tolerance arrow that you just saw had a large variance in the stiff side of the arrow and the weak side. So again, the cheaper the arrow, the more this is going to matter. And so once you go through and index all of your arrows, then you're ready for the next step. But if you don't have an arrow spine tester like this and you can't index it, I'm going to show you guys how to do this on your leg. So what you'll do is you'll want to take this arrow and put it in your thigh like this, okay? And then you'll take your hand and roll it. And then pay attention to how it feels, and you should be able to feel that spot. That's like, oh, okay, I see what you're talking about. Some people will take and put knocks on each end and then put it in a bucket or a bathtub of water, and then you put it in a bathtub of water, and then it'll float to the side that's heavy. So the heavy side will be on the bottom, obviously. That's another option. A lot of people float their shafts. I didn't find that to be as helpful. You can make this yourself. You just need a couple of rollers like this, and then something that suspends it, and then a weight, which this could be anything. You could just make these hooks, and then it's not as advanced or precise, but at least it gives you an idea, and it's better than nothing. So there's a lot of options. You can look up how to index your arrows online for sure. There's a lot of different options. Maybe the water tank will be best for you, filling up a bathtub. Maybe going to your pro shop and asking them to help you with this. Maybe they have a RAM, spine tester. or maybe you just use your leg. And honestly, you may not notice a difference out if you're only shooting inside 30 yards. So again, a lot of this is building like long range missiles. I mean, I'm wanting to build the ultimate arrow that is incredibly accurate past 70 yards. You know, I'm building an arrow that makes a difference. Like all of this stuff makes a difference at 100, 110, 120 yards. You know, I want the most accurate arrow possible, and following each one of these steps is critical. So we're going to move on now to the next step. Well guys, we are almost ready to start building these arrows, but there's one more step that's important before we start the build, and that is weighing every single component, arrow, everything. I'm talking whatever insert you're going to use, weighing every single vein, weighing inserts, I mean any component, weighing the arrows, and I'll explain in a minute why that's important, but it is very, very important because you're going to want all of your components to come together on the finished product to weigh almost identical from arrow to arrow. And because what'll happen is especially in lighter pounds, you know, if you got 5-6 grain increments that are varying between arrow and arrow, that alone is going to cost, you know, a few inches, sometimes maybe more at longer ranges in accuracy. And it's hard enough to hit a bullseye, so you don't want to put anything against you. And having arrows that the finished arrow not weighing the same as one of those. Now there is a degree of tolerance, and what I found for me is about 3 grains. You know, anything under like 3 grains, I haven't really noticed much of a difference. Maybe, you know, ½ inch if I'm really getting picky potentially, but who knows if that was me or the arrow. But after 4 grains at 80 yards, I do notice a difference. Like 4 or 5 grains, we're talking, you know, massive difference. I don't know why, but when we're talking, you know, 3 grains, not a whole lot, but 4 grains and 5 grains, it definitely starts dropping. I've had arrows drop as much as 6 inches from 5 grains, which is not good. And we're talking 80, 90 yard shots. And so it's important that we build each one of these arrows to be identical. So how you do that is you weigh all the arrows and then you categorize them on light, medium, or heavy. You know, so if I get a grain scale that's actually a jewelry scale because it's extremely precise. So I got that set on grains. So I will weigh these arrows. Okay, so that's 321 grains. And so I will put that there. And then I will, again, cheap arrows, you're going to have bigger variances. 320.8. If it's within 0.2, it's good. So it's 321 to 3, that is fine. I'm looking for a ½ grain difference. 20.5. So now we're a ½ grain difference. So this is going to go into the medium, and now this is established as a light arrow at 320.5. 320.8. This is right down the center. 321. So this is on the heavy side, but I mean it's within 0.2, so it's still down the center. It's not too crazy here. 320.7, so 320.5. So then this one was 320.5, so we're about a ½ grain, you know, different. Now you're like, what the heck? What are you talking about? A ½ grain? You're crazy. Why you dividing arrows over a ½ grain? Well, this will matter because guys, let's say there's a ½ grain here and a ½ grain there, and then you put all these together. Next thing you know, you got an arrow that's 4 grains light, you got an arrow that will shoot 6 inches high, or if it's 4 grains heavy, you might have an arrow that'll shoot 6 inches low. So this is important that we weigh all this. So now that we have, most of these arrows are really, really close, and again, higher quality arrows, you're not gonna have massive variances. But with lower quality arrows, you'll see different variances in this. So now what I want to do is with I'm going to weigh all these different components, and I'll combine the light components with the heavy arrows, and then the heavy components with the light arrows to kind of build that perfect blend to get the arrows to weigh the same at the end. So next up, we're going to do vanes, and we're going to weigh our vanes. Now I got 3 different brands of vanes because this is important too, and there's actually especially if you're gonna run like a off-colored vein, it's important to weigh those too. So out of all these veins, you know, you're gonna wanna pull these out. This is what this is for, these bowls here, is I'm gonna weigh all the veins that I'm going to fletch, and I'm going to put them in categories based on what they weigh. So I will throw this vein on here, and that is 6 grains. So I will put that in 6 grains. 5.7, that's light. It's 0.2. Remember, my tolerances is 0.2. 6 grains. 5.9, that's close. So right there, that goes, because 6 is the standard. So 5.6, now we're getting light, so that's a light vein. 6. And so again, the whole point is I go through all of these, I find them 6. But you'll see 5.7. And this is an extremely accurate jewelry scale. So the tolerances are really tight. 6.2. So this one's slightly heavy. So that one goes over there. So this is typically what I'll have, is I'll have a middle of the ground, what the veins usually weigh, 5.7, and then one 5.4. So now we're like super light. Oh, let's readjust this and see. 5.6. Okay. So again, these are considered light. 5.6. All right. So now you get the idea. And so different veins are made up of different materials, stuff like that. Some of them have higher tolerances. So you saw about a half a grain differences, sometimes 0.6 grains difference in tack veins. Now, a vein that I found that has really tight tolerances is actually AAE veins. So if we go here and look at this, you know, you'll notice 9 grains. Or, oh, let's see here. 8.6. 8.5. 8.6. This has been pretty consistent with me. Let it settle. 8.8. But yeah, so anyway, these guys, yeah, 8.8. So these guys have really tight tolerances. The only downside that I found with AE is the weight, quite frankly. That's why, you know, I'm shooting tack veins. But if you're looking for a good vein that has extremely high tolerances to weight, and it's honestly is a good vein, is an AE vein. But I like the tack veins because this one's a 2.6 and weighs 8 grains. This is 2.7. It's a longer vein and it weighs only 6 grains. So two grains less, which is, I know we're talking like small things, but when I fletch, you know, now we're talking 8 grains difference, which is 8 grains I could have more on the front. So all this adds up. But here's something else I wanted to show you. Even with the same brand, but different colors require different types of material to be used, not necessarily different dyes. But look at this. 6.9. Oh, I didn't square it off. There we go. Okay. Oh, 6.9. So the other ones were 6 grains. These ones weigh almost a whole extra grain, you know, per thing. So that's important to know, because if, let's say I'll be building Sarah's arrows here today too. So let's say I was adding these together. Well, that's important that I do this the same, because one weighs 6 grains, one weighs 7 grains. And so I'm going to want to offset these on the arrow so they're opposite of each other. And again, this is like super advanced, and maybe it's not necessary for a lot of shooters, but I would consider myself, you know, a long-range hunter, a long-range shooter. I want everything I can do to give myself an advantage. Especially, you know, it's like, it's hard, like I said, it's hard enough to hit a bullseye. You know, why not take the extra time and effort to weigh all this stuff out, so then you can tell and know, you know, like bam, I have the best possible arrow, you know, and it's going to give me even the smallest advantage. Because honestly, if I get 1% better, 1% better, I'll take it, because that 1% could be the difference between me killing a buck of a lifetime or me wounding him or hitting him high or any of those things. So 1% makes a difference. All right, real quick, I wanted to show you these bully veins. All right, bully veins. On the package says 7 grains, right? So we come here, we slap that buddy on there. It's actually almost 8 grains. This is actually a good vein too, honestly. 8.2, 7.6. So again, I would categorize these. So this one has some variability between the veins, just like tack veins do. So well, the point is no matter what veins you're shooting, don't think they all weigh the same. All right, so I'll categorize these and I'll write, you know, if there was more, I'll do like, you know, 5.5 and then stick a sticky there, and then I'd build these all the way up, and I would leave these over the course of a few days. So I would take notes. That's what the notepad's for. But I'm just doing this for sake of time and speed for you guys to not worry about this. So just know light, middle of the ground, and heavy. And I would go through the entire pack of veins that I have and categorize them all. Because ideally, if you got shafts like I do that are really close together, you're going to have an arrow that, let's say, all weigh the exact same. Well, now you're going to want to put everything from one weight class on there. You know, you don't want to mix veins. And then if you have enough veins to do that, great. If not, don't worry about it. It's not that big of a deal. All right, and then weighing the components, and I'll divide all these up. You guys get the idea. I don't want to spend a lot of time here because we still have a lot to cover. But the point is you want to take, let's say this arrow is heavy, you'd want to take the light components and put with the heavy arrow, because then the net weight of the arrow will be the same as, let's say, a heavy arrow, or a middle of the arrow. You take middle things, and then you got a heavy arrow. You take this heavy arrow, sorry, goes with light components, and then the light arrows go with the heavy components, because you want to offset the weight so they end up being the same. Sorry, that got a little confusing there for a second. But the point is once you build these arrows down to this tolerance, you'll build them and they'll all be within a half a grain. You know, I get kind of crazy to where I'm within a quarter of a grain of each other, and sometimes they're all just exact. So it works out that way. But anyway, that is the next step before building the arrows. So now it is time to build the arrow. Let's do it. So I just went ahead and did what my normal process is, because I wanted to show this to you guys. So I went through and I weighed every single component and insert, and I divided it into 3 categories, A, B, and C. And then I wrote the grain weight on there just for frame of reference in case I start building these tomorrow or something and need to remember. So I put all the light components that are within 2 grains of each other in the A column. I put all the normal components and their weight in the B and the C's. So then what I do with these arrows is then I will weigh the arrows, and then the light arrows will get the heavy the components, and then the normal arrows will get the B components, and then the heavy arrows will get the light components. Again, trying to get that total weight of the arrow at the end to an exact grain. And again, 3 grain tolerances are okay. But one thing before we move on to building, it's very, very important that you guys actually weigh your broadheads, because this is where a lot of people can get screwed. And you know, I'm a big fan of Severn. I've used them a lot, but what they do is they will not tolerate weak metals of any kind. So sometimes you get a big vein variant, or a big grain variance. So like this is supposed to be 100 grain. Well, this is supposed to be 100 grain and it's 97 grains. You know, this is supposed to be 100 grain and it's 99.2 grains. So in some of these, I've had Severs weigh 105 grains. You know, so you just need to make sure you weigh these and weigh your field points, because you do all this stuff and you get exact arrows and then you throw on field points that have 4 grain variances. You're going to get screwed either way. And you know, it's kind of nice though with some of the variances in field points is, again, quality. If you buy the super cheap ones, they're not going to be as exact as the high-end ones. But the major contributor here is definitely going to be broadheads. So make sure you weigh your broadheads, categorize the broadheads, because if you got an arrow that's a grain light and you got a broadhead that's a grain heavy, you slap that broadhead onto that arrow and that arrow will be just as accurate as all the others. So we are now going to move on and keep diving into this extreme arrow build. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I know this is heavy. If you are enjoying this, give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments. We appreciate it. And as always, turn on that bell notifications and hit subscribe if you could. So that'd be great. All right, let's keep going. All right, so now you want to fine tune what this perfect arrow looks like for you, like in terms of speed and maybe FOC and all of that. So I've developed a rule of thumb that I've followed, and this is coming from reverse engineering the perfect arrow with a perfect setup, and this has just been my personal experience. So don't take this for gospel, but I think it works really, really well. And so that is building an arrow that is 5.3 to 6.3 grains per pound of bow weight. So for example, if I shoot 82 pounds and I times that by 5.3, that total arrow weight should be 434 grains, 0.6 grains on the low end. So on the low end, and then on the upper end, I will do 6.3 times 82 pounds, and that's 516.6 on the high end. So my ultimate arrow build needs to be, for me, 434 grains to 516 grains. And there's a magic spot in the middle, which is typically where I want to be. So what I do is then I start doing mock builds without gluing anything on. So then I'm like, okay, so here's my arrow, and my arrow by itself weighs, 320 grains. So I will grab a 100 grain field point here, since obviously I'm going to be needing to shoot a 100 grain point. So then I add that on there. So now it's at 421. And so I don't have an insert on there. So then I want to, let's see, can I do, maybe I want to do an insert and outsert combo. So now we're at 469, which is okay. But I also run a lighted knock. So now we're at 483. And then I'm going to do a 4-fletch. So I better add on 4 of these fletches, just like this. So we're at a 506 grain arrow. Okay, so we're actually towards the upper end on the high end here at 506. But that's not terrible, because that's a 4-fletch, a 4-fletch with an insert and outsert combo. So we're talking with a 100 grain point. So that's going to be pretty good FOC. And speaking of FOC, my rule of thumb is I try to get at least 12%. I found I don't really pay attention to that number at all. Honestly, it's not like it needs to be like 15.5%. But what I like to do is I like to measure this, because if I do find like this perfect arrow that worked unbelievably well for me, it's a part of the equation that I can share with you guys that say, hey, if you're having troubles, check to see if your arrow falls into this spectrum. And so for me, I found that at least 12% is great. You can get upwards to 19%. I think Sarah's build this year with her X impacts is like 19%, but she's shooting lower poundage. So, I mean, it's pretty cool. But anyway, so I do mock builds. Back to this. I do mock builds. And so I'll put the insert in here like this, and I'll put the 100 grain point on there. And what that'll do is it'll allow me to test all these different things. So I'm like, ooh, that's a little heavy. I wanted to build a speed dart. Well, then I wouldn't want to shoot, you know, let's weigh this. I wouldn't want to shoot 48 grains of insert weight. Maybe I would want to take one of these off, like the insert, for example, and only run an outsert. Well, there you go. Or maybe I want to, and that's 40 grains right here. Well, maybe I'm wanting to build an even lighter arrow. Well, maybe I'll rob from Easton and shoot maybe a deep 6-point, because maybe a deep 6-point only weighs 19 grains. And so one thing you'll find with these guys is with a deep 6, it won't fit, but the back part does. So what I do is I take a deep 6-point, thread it in here, and then I take a drill and I drill with sandpaper and drill this out until it does fit. So you can definitely do that with your Black Eagles if you wanted to. So it's kind of cheating, but it all depends what you want to do in terms of building the ultimate arrow. For everyone, that's a little different. Maybe you're a speed guy and you want to build a fast arrow. I like to build a relatively balanced arrow in terms of FOC with a 12%, but around that 500 grain mark is what I'm always trying to go for. And the reason I always want to go around that 500 grain mark is because my bow will still shoot around 300 feet per second. And that's important to me because if I build an arrow based around that 300 feet per second, it's what I've been shooting for years. So I know at 63 yards, I go full draw, and then that buck steps 2 more yards. I know my arrow is going to drop 4 inches with the 2 yards or 6 inches, whatever it is. But I've been doing that for, so many years. That number really helps. So if I'm plus or minus, 5 feet per second, I'm going to be deadly with off situations, which is what I like to prepare for, because you just never know, what you're going to get into. Maybe after practicing for years, if I go full draw and I feel a gust on my face, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's like 10 miles per hour. And again, I don't know this for sure. I just know in the moment, my brain has enough experience to make that perfect calculation. So then I know, oh, 10 miles an hour, it's at 80 yards. I'm going to hold, 6 clicks to the right, and I'll hold 6 inches right. Bam, and I smoke the deer. Or if I have a new arrow, and let's say I go on the light end of the spectrum and I'm at that 430 grain mark, yeah, I got an arrow that'll shoot 315 feet per second, but now I feel that same 10 mile per hour per wind and I hold 6 inches and shoot, but now it shoots 9 inches to the left because it's lighter. Well, I could have wounded that animal. So I'm not saying 500 grains is the magic number for me. It's just what I have the most experience for. So if I have an option, I'm going to want to build an arrow around that 300 feet per second mark. Now, again, for you guys building an arrow, you take this equation, the 5.3 to 6.3, and you're shooting 70 pounds. That means your arrow weight would be 5.3, times 73 pounds. Would be 439, whoops. So, yeah, so 5.3 times 70, that's 370 grain arrow, and 70 times on the 70 pounds on the upper end would be like 440 grains. So it's not the grain of the arrow, it's just what I found to shoot the best. So again, building this, I will go through all the different kind of scenarios with this. And then I will, once I figure out what I kind of want, I'm like, okay, I built the perfect arrow and it's 540 grains. I'm like, oh, that's too heavy. I'm going to take something off. So maybe I would switch from a 4-fletch to a 3-fletch and take some of that grains off the back. And then I'm like, okay, well, now I'll shoot that. Some things that will never change is I always will shoot a light and knock. That's heavy. This sucker weighs like 14 grains. And so whenever you put that sucker on there, you're automatically adding 14 grains right to the back of the arrow. So if you don't care about filming or shooting these when you practice, then swapping these out for an arrow, a knock that weighs half that could be a big help. But anyway, so I do mock builds like this. And what this will do is it'll help me figure out what I want. So with this, at 507 grains with a 200 spine arrow, I'm going to be very happy. And I could build a much lighter arrow with a 250 spine, but from experience, 250 spine isn't stiff enough for 82 pounds with all the FOC that I would want to have. I tried to make it work, guys, I did. My 250s, they tuned well, but my groups were huge. It sucked. And that's one of the reasons why I'm excited about shooting these XM packs, is because, you know, Easton doesn't make an arrow spine, you know, stiffer than 250. And so since I've always been a high pounded shooter, I'm very excited about these 200s because they tune so much better for me. And therefore, a better tuned arrow is a more accurate arrow. All right, so that wraps up the pre-build, you know, the segment here. You know, this has been kind of overwhelming, I know, guys, but hanging in there with me. You know, we divided everything up, we measured all the components, we've got the perfect arrows ready to be put together. Now, how I put those arrows together is exactly what's going on next. One last thing before we piece it all together, I want to show you guys how to calculate your FOC, and it's pretty easy. So what you want to do is have your completed arrow build or your mock build. And so like if you're going to mock build an arrow, it's better to, obviously this is a completely built arrow, but if you're going to mock build one, you can use electrical tape and then wrap that electrical tape around the back of the arrow in the exact same position of your fletchings in the exact same weight. So then I would wrap, this weighs about 23 grains. I would wrap 23 grains of electrical tape, and an easy way to do that, you weigh the arrow and then you keep adding, you know, electrical tape back here until it's an additional 23 grains. Then I will take that insert and put it on here, put everything in there without being glued, and then I will test the FOC. And how I do that, we'll just use this for sake of an example, but then you find the balancing point, and I like to use a razor blade edge. I'll need this. There, once you find the balance, you can just mark that on the arrow. All right, and then what you'll want to do is you'll measure your whole arrow, and then you just find an FOC calculator on the internet. You can Google it. There's a ton of them, and then you would just run that. But anyway, you measure from the throat of your nock to the base of the insert. And so for me, with this, I shoot a 29 or 28 and just a hair shy of 3/8, 28 and 3/8 arrow. And then I would put that into the calculation and measure from the throat of the nock to the balancing point, and that'll give me that FOC calculation. So that is a quick FOC tip for you guys. I think Gold Tip has one on there. There's a lot of them. But anyway, just wanted to share that with you in case you were wondering. So now we're getting into putting all the components in here. So I have my arrow. I look back here. I see it's B. It's been properly indexed. B means it's right in the middle of all this. So I pull the components all from B because it's in the middle. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And again, if this arrow was heavy, I would pull from the light, and if it was light, I would pull from the heavy. But since it's right in the middle, I'll pull from the middle. Okay, so I have all the components right here. All of these are ready to go. Now, I use hot melt even on my carbon shafts. You see a lot of guys super glue their stuff in, and I don't like to do that because if I ding this on a tree or something and this is bent, well, now the whole arrow's junk. Well, you guys see the process I go through for each and every single individual arrow. It is daunting to do this. So I would rather just be able to go out there and take a torch and heat it up and pop it off and replace it. Makes it super nice. Okay, so what I do with this is I will take a pair of needle noses like this and just kind of hold the end, and then I will heat it, not a ton, just enough so the glue will sit on that, right? And then I take this, and I'll heat this as well. And I lather it on there pretty good because whatever won't fit will absolutely squirt out the bottom there. So burn that off. So I got that. And then so what I will do here is I will take this and shove it in here, but I'm going to press this up against something cold. See, I took a little long, so I'll just reheat that a little bit, and then it'll slide right in. Okay, so then I hold that there. You don't want to do this on anything other than metal, and push, because then what you could do is peel that baby off just like that. And she is sleek and clean. That's what you want, with a little bit of extra. And now hot melt, I love the Easton hot melt. It works really, really well. As you can see, it even sticks to paper. Just kidding. Okay, next up, I'm going to glue this on. Now this, I don't have the focused outserts. I'm like 90% sure I am going to shoot the focus outserts here, but this is a normal insert over top of another insert like this. So normal, this is why I like the focus outsert system, is it's got a screw that just threads in and then screws into there. I don't actually have to glue this on the shaft. But because I do have to glue this one off on the shaft, because I don't have the focus outsert system for a 200 spine, I will show you guys how I do this. And this is going to be very bizarre and weird. Alrighty, now the way I do this is actually pretty bizarre and weird. But what I'll do is I'll get this really hot and almost dripping, and then I'm just going to coat the carbon like this. And it's going to just look really bad. It's just what it's going to do. Don't worry about it. And I will show you why. Okay, so then that's what it looks like. And you're like, why on earth would you do this? So but then this is what I do. I will heat this up like this and get this nice and hot. I'll go down inside because I don't want any extra. Okay, and then I'm going to be far away because I don't want to heat the carbon. You see that? And I'm far away so I don't damage the carbon, but do you see how the glue just melted? And this is nice and hot. Now I will stick this sucker right on there, and that's good. Okay, so before I cool this off, I'm actually going to screw on the broadhead. Okay, and then I'm going to spin this and test this and then twist this. I mean, that is as good as it gets. That's just beautiful. But if it was wobbly, I'd want to do that. And so there, now that it's perfect, I know I'm going to get crap for this, but I cool it off as fast as possible. I dip it into cold water. And this is actually not cold, it's just like room temperature water. But I do this because I want this to cool off without damaging the carbon. But people say, well, if you heat up and cool off the carbon, you could damage it. But that's why this is at room temperature. It's not cold, but it does cool it off. And then I can go and peel off all the extra glue. And again, this tip is still replaceable. That's what's going to be super nice about this, is I can still replace this tip. And all I got to do is heat it up and it'll slide right off. And that's super nice. And I've never had any issues whatsoever with this. And sometimes you got to take a little bit of a razor blade and just peel off some of the extra glue, but like that. And then, but be careful sliding back like this. It's the only bad thing about that glue. It doesn't have a nice peel off, but it sticks really well, so I like that. Okay, so there you go. I got the insert in there. Everything's good to go. Now, I would do this with all my arrows. So I would keep everything all, and I would just go through, and then I'd fletch all my arrows. But because, for sake of time, I'm not going to go through and build each one of these tips. I'm going to go right into fletching an arrow. Okay, so my first step before I fletch an arrow is I'm going to clean the base of the arrows off with acetone. And you'll see why I do this. So look, if I take this, a lot of people don't realize there's a lot of dirt and everything here. But now be careful, because remember how we indexed the arrow. So you don't want to wipe that part off where you marked it. So I'll take this. This is acetone. And now I'm going to clean this. And again, I just kind of watch that so I don't wipe that off. And then I go down here and clean these arrows where I'm going to be fletching. But you can see all the dirt and grime that comes off the arrow. So you want to keep these clean. So what I typically do is drop them all. But no, so you just keep a paper towel down there like that. Let me get on these guys. But again, you want to make sure you clean all of these and clean the side, obviously, that you're going to be fletching. So we'll just get these cleaned up real fast, and I will get these going. Now keep in mind, I'm doing this because I've already built these arrows and I know they're perfect. So that's why I've already cut them. So again, take my advice whenever I'm telling you to build one all the way through. That way you don't know, that way you don't make a mistake and ruin an entire dozen, like I've done many times. Okay, so what I recommend doing with fletching your arrows is use the nocks that come with the arrow itself. So that works really well, using these nocks. Even though you are going to use lighted nocks in the field, it's important to use these, and I'll explain in a hot second. So I know you guys are going to ask, so I'm just going to tell you like my current setup with how I'm with what I'm doing here. This is pretty crazy. So this is a fire nock like Fletcher. So it is a fletching jig. This is a super high-end jig, but it doesn't have a helical. It only has offset. So I actually modified and grinded off. You can see I notched it right here. I notched this with a grinder. This is a Bitzenberger Fletcher, and then I grinded off the tip here. So then I modified this so it would fit and work on this. I like this Fletcher a lot. I don't like that it only does an offset because it's kind of designed for his own veins and not like other people's veins, which is okay. But this is an extreme Fletcher because it's got lasers. It's fun. Look at the lasers. I'm like a cat. Get distracted. But no, this is a really precise and well-engineered fletching jig. Okay, so now I have this. This is where that index is super important to remember. And so when you put this sucker in here, that line is where I indexed it, remember? Okay, so that line, I want that to be in the middle. There it is. So I want that line to be in the middle between these two fletchings. So that's going to be important for me. I want that to line up so then whenever I knock it in my bow, like this, that strong index is either going to be straight above or straight below or to the right or the left, but it'll be consistent. So you want it to be in the exact same spot every single time. So I want it right in the middle of my forefletch. So what I've done is I've marked on here, you can see where that red line is. This is where that laser helps, where that red line is. So now I just twist this on the nock and line that puppy up with this red line here. So you can see, I marked that. That's right down the middle between two. And then you look at that right there on the arrow, and bam, we're ready to roll. So now I'll go back to 0 and I'll do 0, 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and then 270 degrees with my forefletch. And so this is also, I know you're like, okay, I know how to fletch an arrow, but I'm telling you guys, so many people mess this next part up. So what I'm going to do, show you, you can use with the Bitzenberger, you can do with a last chance fletching. Everything that I'm going to do is universal between all fletching jigs. So don't think you have to have this exact one to do what I'm going to tell you. Let's get started. Okay, so on the bottom of your clamp, this will collect glue and get nasty. So you're going to want to have a razor to be able to scrape. So you could see the glue from the last time I fletched it. So you're going to want to scrape all that glue off. Now what a lot of people do, what a lot of people do is they'll mark on the side right here. But depending on what angle you're looking at your Fletcher, you know, you could be off, you know, 1/4 of an inch, or not 1/4, but like 1/8 of an inch, and then you'll have one vein a little forward, one vein a little back, and that can actually get pretty frustrating. So what I actually do is I mark it on the bottom with a Dremel tool. So I'll take a Dremel tool and actually cut into the jig itself so it's receded on this. So if you look in here real closely, I'll wipe it off so you can see. So you can kind of see the hole there, or the grind. It's actually hard to get that stuff out of there. But you can kind of see how I took a Dremel tool and grinded it. So then what I'll do is I'll take a marker, like a red one, and mark inside that crack. So now whenever I scrape this, the blade goes over top my mark. So I don't keep scraping off my mark. That's why I use a Dremel tool. If you just mark on the bottom and you're scraping off glue, well, guess what's going to happen? You're just going to scrape off your mark every time. So that helps that, but also helps with alignment. Because now, when I drop that vein in there like this, and I slide that puppy down, I'm looking, and I'll have you come right over my shoulder to see this. I'm looking straight down. I'm not, there's no, like here, for example, I could show you. I'll put it, I'll try to line it up here. Whoops. If I line it up here, but I'm looking at it from like this angle, and I line it up there, and then I change the angle, I can easily mistake in that. But if I go here, I slide that puppy down, and I'm going to line that sucker up with that Dremel tool cutout, or that red line. And for me, it's on this side of the line, which is perfect. Now, where I fletch my arrows, this is also important, is I fletch exactly an inch and a quarter down from the throat of the nock, because you want to make sure, and I've done other videos on this, and if you haven't seen them, make sure to hit them on fletching inaccuracies. People do this where they'll fletch it too close to their face and they're getting facial pressure, where they're pushed into the face and then they're tuning around facial pressure, which is bad news, because if you're doing that, that means if it's even a little bit inconsistent each time, you're gonna have, you know, bad hits and inaccurate setups. So you want to get those veins in front of your face so you're not touching your face. And for me, that's an inch and a quarter. And for you, it may be closer. Maybe you have a smaller face, maybe you have a plump face, maybe you have a chiseled face. I don't know. Each one of those will vary from person to person, so just make sure you test this before you go fletching all of your arrows and you realize it's in your face. You're like, great, you know, I just wasted a ton of time. All right, so we line it up, inch and a quarter down. Now, I used to take acetone and put on the base of my veins, and I would actually still do these with AAE veins because they handle it quite nicely. But tack veins don't handle acetone very well, and they don't stick as well as if I were to just use their primer pen. So they talk about this primer pen, it's for a reason. So one thing I do is I'll make sure the primer pen is wet and producing. So every single time before I swipe my finger to feel that it's wet so I know that it's working. Then I just swipe one swipe right down that pen. And I'll blow on it to make sure it's dry. And now this part is important, how you put the glue on. So always have a piece of paper towel sit next to you. Because what I'm going to do, and I'll see if I can get in a better spot for you guys to see here. So what I'll do is take and put a generous bead right down the center here. Oh, hang on one second. Sometimes when the glue gets, is actually a good tip I'll give you guys. Sometimes if the glue's kind of thick and not coming out, get yourself a little tack, and then you can clean out that hole there, and that'll help you. So that's a great little side tip there. Okay, so now I am going to run that bead right down here, right down the middle. Okay, so if you look, and I'll wait until you guys can see how lumpy that is, and even see some air bubbles right here. You can see air bubbles. It's a little lumpy and inconsistent. It might be better to see it from that angle. But what I do next is I will take my finger, my naked finger, and I'm going to run this right down this arrow like this, right down the base of the vein. And then look at that. You can see how smooth, clear, and all the bubbles are gone. That crystal clear smoothness is what you want. And now I'm going to put it on the arrow itself. This is another important part. A lot of people grab it like this and start fletching, but what happens is you can push the arrow. So what I do is I take my hand, hold it here, so I'm pushing on here. I'm holding the arrow with this hand inside, making sure it's not twisting, and then I come down and then I apply quite a bit of pressure right here. This holds for 5 seconds, so I hold a lot of pressure for 10 seconds. And then I let off, and then I'm going to investigate this guy and make sure that I got a little bit of glue coming out the ends here, and make sure that both ends are secure. This is good. So if anything's up or out of it, then I'm like, I don't know if I like it. Then I will take it and tear it off. So I'm going to tear this one off just to show you guys how to clean them. So if I tear this off, they need a little bit to set. You see how there's like glue residue? And you could try to wipe that off, but there's still some left. This is where you could take a razor blade and scrape this off and get all that excess glue. Like that. Now once you do this, again, this is going to be important that you re-acetone the base of the shaft and clean it, because you got to redo it. I wanted to throw that in there for you guys just so you guys get a rebuild of that. You get an idea. So then I want to redo this, make sure that that's right there. Everything's good to go. Bam. Okay. All right, so I put the vein back in, I did the primer pen, got that down, and now I'm going to apply glue again. Nice, generous amount. You always want to be over generous for the initial swipe. It looks like I need to get more glue. Never want there to be air bubbles. And then I take my finger, I wipe off all the excess. And I take a nice little glance. Everything looks good. Again, I go here, start with the heel. If you can see this, I start with the heel like this. I push with this. I make sure that that arrow is not moving. And then I lock it in place. 1,006, 1,007, 1,008, 1,000, 9,000, 10,000. Now one thing I also do, you notice how it's touching the arrow? I did this, is I'll take acetone and put on my fingers so I get all the oil off of my fingers, because you don't want to clean your shaft and then put oily fingers all over it. That's not going to work either. So there you go. This, I'm going to pop this off so you can see there's some excess glue popping out, but I'll clean that up. But you can see there's a little glue popping out the ends. That makes for a nice, good, rock solid fit. So then what I will do now is go to 90. Same exact kind of thing. So, okay. Alrighty. So, now when we look at this, I'll take a paper towel, or actually, even better, I'll grab a couple Q-tips and I could run a Q-tip right down here, getting off the excess glue. Like this. So you don't want to mess around because you don't want the stuff to dry on you. So if you get excess glue, can clean that puppy up with Q-tips. Q-tips are cheap, so. All right. Then I'll go back through one more time and just make sure there's nothing weird going on. Okay. And there. So this is important for you guys to see. Check this out. So, obviously with a 4-fletch, let me grab this bow. So with a 4-fletch, this is how you knock that arrow. So it goes right down the center. So then that way you have the least amount of surface area going over your rest. So check this out. Boom. That's the index of the arrow. So that means that's the stiffest part of the arrow. It's right down the center, and it's going to go right down the center. So every single one of my arrows will be fletched exactly the same way. Now, I know you guys are going to ask, so a lot of you are wondering, well, do you do a helical or an offset, and why? And this is a topic that's been discussed for forever. And you know, I've shot both. I've shot both helical, I've shot both offset, and quite frankly, I don't notice a massive difference, but I do notice a difference with fixed blades. And I do notice that helicals steer fixed blades better for me. And a 4-fletch steers a fixed blade better. Well, I'm using a mechanical, but I mean, heck, if I can get away with the arrow weight and have a little bit more steering capabilities on the back with a 4-fletch, and I have the grain scales or the weight to deal with it, like I showed you guys, that 5.3 to 6.3 grains per pound, I'll do a 4-fletch. Especially if I get the clearance. Now, if I get clearance issues, then I can shoot a 3-fletch. Like I tried shooting the QAD Integrate, for example, and I couldn't get 4-fletch clearance out of it. So I had to shoot a 3-fletch whenever I shot that. But I switched back to a Prophecy rest now, and I get a lot more clearance out of that, so I can go back to shooting a 4-fletch. So that's why I can't say, oh, 4-fletch is 100% better, just because each setup's a little bit different, but I definitely notice a 4-fletch difference in terms of fixed blade flight for sure. And for hunting situations, you know, I've recently just been shooting full-blown helical, and I like it. Everyone talks about, oh, you shouldn't shoot a full-blown helical because the parachute effect, and that's just, I don't know. The parachute effect is basically your groups get bigger and bigger the further out you get, but you know, I don't notice that. I could shoot a sub 4-inch group at 80 yards with a full helical. You know, I don't know if it could get much better than that. So I'm not really going back, I don't think. I might, you never know. And if I do, it's because I figured out something that works better. But I know a lot of you ask 4-fletch versus 3-fletch. I like to shoot 4-fletch if I can, especially with a tack vane because they're a little bit lighter. If you're going to shoot like a heavier vane like an AAE, maybe 4-fletch isn't such a great idea because you're going to be adding like almost 40 grains of vane weight to the back and a lighted nock. It's going to take a lot up front, which will probably put you over the top on that grains per pound. Now back to the grains per pound real quick. That 5.3 to 6.3 is for bows between like 60 pounds and 80 pounds or 90 and above. If you're shooting below 60 pounds, you should always be, or the lower pounds, even in the 60 range, you should be at the upper end of that scale. That specific equation was made for my setup and my 80 pounds. So the lower poundage you go, you probably even need more than 6.3 grains per inch or per pound because of lighter setups, and you need the kinetic energy to get through the animals that you're shooting. Especially if you're shooting low poundage arrows, you may be shooting a 400 grain arrow at 40 grains or 40 pounds. I mean, that's definitely possible. So those situations, I'm not saying that's a gospel truth for all bows, but that is for a good range for a 65 to 80 pound bow if you're looking for that. But all right, so anyway, a segue back to this. There is one last thing that you want to do with your setups, and that is put dabs of glue on the tips of your vanes. Okay, so last up, I like to dab a little bit of glue, and this is Fire Knox fletching glue. I like to use this because it's got a needle. All right, let me know when you are ready, my friend.
Go for it.
Okay, so I just dab. I like the needle tip because then it's very precise. So I'll do that, and then I'll do the back as well. It's just a little extra securance for me. I like the security of having both ends dyed in. So I will take and get that off too, just an FYI. Okay, there we go. So then I will let this dry. It doesn't take very long. It's ready to go. And that, my friends, is how I build the ultimate arrow. So, and then again, in terms, this is not a tuning video. Please don't get me going with tuning. That's a whole other video I can go into. But I just wanted to show you guys all the steps that I take to get this arrow to specs. And so I wanted to kind of show you guys too, like the end result. I've built a few of them now. I'll grab this grain scale and I will show you, I'll grab some arrows, some finished products, and I will show you how, after all of that, gluing in together everything, I will show you how this works. So we'll weigh the complete arrow build. 507.4 grains. All right, I'm going to grab another arrow. 508 grains. So we're talking 507. That's within a grain of each other. Let's see what this is. 507.7. 507.7, that's exactly the same. So we're talking within 0.3 grains of each other. That is perfect because I would be okay with a 3 grain tolerance. But there you go. This is the arrow that I will be shooting this year. I'm very excited about it. Unless I start having bad experiences with it, then I'll switch. But I really like this so far. It shoots really well, and it is the X-Impact 200 spine for my 82-pound setup. My grains up front are 48 grains insert with a 100 grain point, 4-fletch tack vane. I use the Nocturnals, and I'd shoot a full helical 1.25 inches from the back. FOC is close to 13%. This is a killer setup for my 82-pound bow, and I like this a lot. Sarah's setup is going to be very similar. She shoots a 58-pound bow now because she's pregnant, and so she needed a little less weight, and so, but her arrows are ridiculous. She's shooting like 19%. She's shooting X-Impacts, 400 spine, but with like 70 grain insert with a 100 grain point, and a 4-fletch with a light and knock, and still has like 19% FOC, all within the same specs of 5.3 to 6.3 grains per pound. So it just goes to show you sometimes the lower poundage setups, you can get away with a lot more because the arrows are a lot lighter. So anyway, I hope you really liked this video. If you did, give me a thumbs up and let me know in the comments below. And please hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell notification so you never miss a beat on our video. Thanks again, guys, for watching.